everyone, and welcome to the Sterling Library and the third lecture of the Sterling Historical and Heritage Preservation Committee. We are a group that is hosted by the Sterling Foundation and very pleased to be under their auspices. They've helped us along, and we try to help them along. If you're not familiar with the Sterling Foundation, it's been around for decades here in Sterling Park and the greater Sterling area, and they help to mow the boulevard, down Sterling Boulevard, clean the streams, and they are the major hosts for the Sterling Fest around Columbus Day weekend, and that is like one of the biggest festivals in the entire area. Excuse me for a minute, I'm going to shut this door here. This is the third of our lectures. The first one happened in the fall, and we had, and I say this lovingly, old-timers who lived around the turn of the century, 19th century, who grew up around the W&OD. And I think they kind of forgot where they were in the audience. They just started talking amongst themselves, and we heard all these wonderful stories about what it was like to grow up in Sterling before it became developed. Then in February, for the African American or Black History Month, we had about 93 people fill these rooms. And we learned the history of the area and why Noakes Boulevard is named for the Noakes family, which we have found is a very old family of free blacks who had very large farms in the area, about 200 acres. And we discovered that their family home still exists. If you know where the Bed Bath & Beyond is, that's just there today, and the McDonald's is, if you'll look over behind the McDonald's to the right, they have about 10 acres there, and the family home is there. So they are going to try to save part of that property in the home and put it under historic preservation. I am going to pass around this little sign-in sheet, and if you could give us some information, we would love it if you'd like to be on our list here, and we'll always enjoy your participation if you'd like to come in on our committee as we begin to plan our series for the next year. We sort of go under the academic year. We've done some pre-planning. We've got some ideas as to what we'd like to do for next year. Actually, we've got about 20-some ideas, but we'd like to narrow it down, so if you're interested in working with the committee, just put that down on the list, and we'll certainly give you a call or send you an email when we next meet. Tonight, we have a wonderful presentation on the W&OD Railroad from 1847 to 1963. I've often wondered whether what happened to the railroad might one day happen to Metro. I hope it doesn't. But as you learn this story, it'll give you a flavor for what we've been through in the area. And just in the short time that I've talked to the speakers before we started here, I've learned more about parts of Sterling and what was going to happen here than I even knew before. We've got three wonderful speakers here tonight. I've had the pleasure of hearing two, Paul McRae and David Gallaudet, speak at both the City of Fairfax Library and Paul at the Herndon Historical Society. And we have a newcomer tonight, Neil Stern, who has been doing a lot of work on Vestals Gap Road, so I think we're going to have some engaging conversation. We've left a lot of time for your questions, so keep them in mind till after the presentation. I think you're going to love the photos. I do want to mention that we have 4 committee members who are very much engaged in what we do here, so I'd like them just to stand up briefly. Mark Gunderman in the back. You may have read many of his articles or his blogs. He writes quite a bit in the Loudoun and area papers. Todd Gallant, who is also a board member on the Sterling Foundation, and he's a jack of all trades. And my husband, Madik Siski, and he put all the chairs out for you tonight. You need that, you need that person who does that. and who gives me support at home for doing what I'm doing and also helping Todd and Mark as needed. So we welcome you all. This book here, the guys will talk about a little bit later on, and it is available for sale, but this one is mine. I've already reserved it. Washington Dominion Railroad, Images of the Rail there, by David and by Paul. So if you'd like it to be autographed, they're here tonight to do that for you. And I'm not going to say a whole lot about what they're going to talk about. I'm going to let them do that because most likely you are here because you have already read about and know what they're going to speak about. But I do want to let you know if you should leave early to try to grab one of these from the podium up here. We cannot do these lectures without the support of the public. We are a nonprofit organization. So if you're able to give the $20 membership fee to the Sterling Foundation and add a few bucks for the historical committee, that would be wonderful. Okay? So I have those up here. All right, everyone comfortable? Lighting good? No? All right. Okay, I think we have Paul and David up first. Need the lights out? Okay.
Well, the front ones anyway, maybe.
Huh?
The front ones, maybe.
Front, okay. Oops, those are, don't want those on. All these high-tech lights. You're putting more on, don't it? It's the bottom one right there. We'll get it. That's down. Perfect. Okay. Thank you. We also want to thank the Sterling Library and Kelly John, who we work with to put these presentations on. We have this beautiful new library and all this wonderful room, so we're pleased to partner with you and be here. Okay, enjoy.
Well, tonight I'm going to talk a little bit and quickly about why there came to be a railroad running through Guilford, Sterling, what the railroad as a whole did, and then I'm going to talk about why it's not here. David's going to cover more specifically about the history of the railroad in Sterling. So, am I in the camera range?
You are.
Yeah.
Okay. I usually try to start off by emphasizing how important the W&OD was to the history and the layout of Northern Virginia. If you've ever driven, say, between Leesburg and Falls Church on Route 7, what are the names of the towns and the communities along the way? There's Drainesville, which is sort of a community, but there's not a lot of towns or developments along Route 7, and that's because Route 7 was, for years, a muddy little road that nobody wanted to use. People wanted to be near the railroad. That was Main Street for Northern Virginia, and that's where the towns grew up. So Falls Church was already developed, but Dunloring was created. Vienna was there because of the railroad. Reston was originally Wheelie. Herndon was developed as a railroad town. Sterling, Ashburn, that's where people wanted to live because that's where they could get on the train and get to the next town or get into Washington to a job. Or if you're a farmer, you want to be near the train station so you can get your cattle, your wheat, your milk, things like that, and have it shipped to where people would buy it. So in 1847, when the railroad, which became the W&OD, was first authorized, this was kind of transportation in Northern Virginia. It was with horse and wagons, buggies. One new development that took place was the C&O Canal on the other side of the Potomac River. That was an option for people who could make it across the river, take a canal boat down to the city, to Alexandria, Georgetown, Washington, or in some cases, farmers would put their products on the canal boat get them to the markets. But it was slow. During the summer when there were droughts, it wasn't always feasible. In the winter when it froze, everything shut down. So that still wasn't a perfect solution for transportation for Northern Virginia. Another thing that developed was the B&O Railroad, which was just on the other side of the river. It ran from Baltimore to Harper's Ferry. So that was a lot more reliable. Railroads were fairly new. It could go year-round. Even during snowstorms, it typically could run. So it became very popular to cross the river and put your goods on the B&O Railroad or catch a ride if you were, say, wanted to go to Baltimore to shop instead of going to Alexandria, because you could do it faster using the B&O Railroad. So what that meant was Alexandria started losing business. People weren't coming there as much to shop. Farmers weren't sending their products to Alexandria. So the city fathers in Alexandria knew they needed a railroad. So they petitioned the state legislature and they got their railroad. Originally it was going to be the Alexandria and Harper's Ferry Railroad, and Harper's Ferry was going to be the direction they were going to go. That kind of changed, and instead they were going to go through Loudoun to Hampshire County, West Virginia. The reason Hampshire County was a target for them were the coal fields. They wanted to get out there where they could bring coal into the city of Alexandria. So Lewis Mackenzie was sort of the leader of the movement to get a railroad. He was the first president of the railroad. Construction of railroads back then wasn't real easy. They didn't have powered equipment, bulldozers, things like that. So a lot of the work was done by hand with laborers. At one point we did find a railroad article about one of the companies that had been hired to build the railroad, and they went bankrupt. So the bankruptcy notice listed all their equipment, which gave us a good idea of what they used. So eventually they started using oxen, mules, drags, wagons, because basically Northern Virginia is so rolling. In some areas they needed to cut down like they're doing here. This is not the WNOD, this is the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, but similar timelines, time of construction. So to keep the railroad as level as possible, they cut down in some areas, and then they took that dirt down and filled the cuts, the low spots. And they had to build bridges. There were lots of creeks that crossed what became the eventual line of the railroad, so they had to build bridges, piers, abutments, things like that. This is Goose Creek out in Loudoun County. It was the longest and tallest bridge on the WNOD. And when Nova Parks went to build the trail, the bridge is gone, but all the stone abutments and piers were still there. And after a little bit of work to rehabilitate them, we're still using them today. And they were built in the mid-1950s. This was the first timetable. Once the railroad got running, they reached Farmwell in January of 1860. Farmwell is now Ashburn, just like Guilford is now Sterling. Once they reached Leesburg a little bit later that year, they didn't go any further because of the Civil War. The railroad didn't have a lot of impact to the war. The Confederate troops in Leesburg stole a couple locomotives. They hoisted them onto wagons, pulled them south along Route 15 with oxen, west on 50, and they put them on the Manassas Gap Railroad. And those locomotives ran for the rest of the war on southern railroads. Just the idea of hoisting up a locomotive and pulling it is kind of incredible. They were smaller locomotives than we're used to today, but still pretty heavy. Although they did break a chain pulling it through Goose Creek. So they had to camp out there until they could get some more equipment. There was one small battle in Vienna early on during the war. Didn't have a whole lot of impact. Basically some Union troops coming out on a train. They were attacked by some South Carolina troops. There was some skirmishing. Cannonball broke the locomotive from the passenger cars. The locomotive backed all the way to Alexandria, and the Union soldiers had to walk home. This was Vienna Station towards the end of the war. There were tents all around. You can see one in the upper left corner, but the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry was bivouacked right around the train station, and they were the outfit that chased Mosby throughout the war. But this was the end line for the railroad, because the partisan rangers with the southern troops kept burning bridges west of Vienna. They just really couldn't keep the line open, so it was shut down. And at that point, there were troop movements along the railroad, but that was about it. One thing I found, besides having the cavalry unit stationed there, a lot of the firewood they needed in Washington for the offices and the soldiers came from the Virginia countryside, and our railroad hauled a lot of that firewood in. So after the war, it took a few years for the railroad to get started again. They changed their name to the Washington, Ohio, aiming a little bit further west, the Ohio River. It was just never really well funded. The war didn't help. Because it was in Virginia, the federal government considered it an enemy railroad, even though the people that ran it before the war were all pro-union. So it took a while to get it started again. In 1874, they finally reached Purcellville and Round Hill. It took that long to get the money to build and to do the actual construction, although a lot of the grading and bridges had already been built almost to Purcellville, but it was just the final grading and laying the tracks and getting the money for that. So it hit Round Hill, and then it stayed there for a while. There were some recessions in the 1870s. They just didn't have the money, they didn't have the capital investment to keep pushing forward, which was to get out to Winchester as their next leg. So for the business that they did have by 1874, they did a number of things. The railroad station was where you went to send telegrams or receive a telegram. There weren't telephones yet, easily available. There was mail, and the post office was in the train station. But the fastest way to get a message was through Western Union, and there were always kids hanging around the station whenever they weren't in school. So if a telegram came in, they would get a penny or a nickel, and they would run it to whoever's house the telegram needed to go to. The railroad station was the UPS of their day also. The Railway Express was how you would get delivery of small shipments of things. So if you ordered a bicycle from Sears and Roebuck, it would be sent to the nearby train station. And then you would get a message that it was there, and you would go and collect it. So by 1882, the W&OD, or the W&O Railroad, had gone under, and it became the Washington and Western, kind of a vague goal, and not really well funded either. It later became the Washington, Ohio and Western. Again, not real successful. Eventually the railroad became part of the Richmond and Danville large railroad conglomerate, which was then gobbled up by the Southern Railway. So the Southern was just grabbing every railroad it could. They didn't buy the railroad that became the W&OD thinking it was going to make a lot of money. They just bought whatever they could. They had a few profitable years. In 1898, the Spanish-American War broke out, and the area around Gallows Road, Dunloring, became a training camp for soldiers being sent overseas for the war. So there's about 26,000 men stationed all around what we consider Merrifield now. And they all came in on the W&OD, and then they were shipped out to get on ships and go overseas. It was reading about Camp Alger. There was very poor sanitary conditions, a lot of disease. We didn't have a lot of, I guess our experience in the Civil War didn't really carry over, and they didn't do a great job at first of establishing clean water, sanitation, things like that. So at this point, the Southern Railway owned the rail line. They called it, by 1900, they were calling it the Bluemont Branch, because the little town of Snickersville in western Loudoun had petitioned the railroad to extend the line just a few more miles to their town. Snickersville had become popular with vacationers. In Washington, D.C. in the summer, it's pretty hot and humid now. Back then, a lot of coal and firewood were being burned for cooking and other purposes. The air was really stagnant, so people would leave the city. They'd go out to the countryside. They would come to Sterling, Leesburg. Bluemont was probably the most popular destination. They had hotels there, the mountains. So when the railroad got the petition to extend the line, they said they would extend it if the townspeople built a station and if they changed their name from Snickersville, because they didn't think it was very attractive. So Snickersville became Bluemont. The railroad ended up there in 1900, and that's where it stayed. Never went any further. But that's not the end. So this was the old Sterling station. It would have been built in the mid to late 1850s. It was fairly typical of that era of construction. It probably had some modifications during the southern time period. The bunked out station master's office on the far end probably wasn't there originally. The reason there was a station built in Guilford probably wasn't because of anything that was around Guilford at the time. I'm sure there were a few homes and some farms, but the railroad sited what they called agency stations every 3 miles more or less, because they knew that farmers, passengers wouldn't go too far to get to a station. So they knew they had to put these stations every 3 miles or so. So that's why Herndon Station is where it is. And then the town grew up around it. Sterling Station was put in, more houses, businesses came in. It just never grew to the size of a Herndon, which maybe isn't a bad thing. But there it was.
I have a question on the Sterling Station. To the best of your knowledge, they didn't build several of them. That picture is like 1927. That was the original station built in 1860?
As far as, I've never read anything that suggested there was more stations than just the original.
All right.
And there have been other towns, Round Hill, Ashburn, that had multiple stations, and we were able to find records in the newspapers of when they burned. Usually they burned. There was a lot of activity that put stations at risk.
Where was the location of this building in comparison to today's?
I'll show you later.
Yeah, David's going to cover that. He's going to talk more specifically about the Sterling area. Okay. This was the next station up the line. This is Ashburn. This was, I think, the second station in Ashburn, and then there was a third station, a more modern one, that was there when the railroad shut down. Again, in going through archives and libraries, we've been able to find, for some towns, we've been able to find old photos that showed different stations at different times. We have about 2,200 photos of the W&OD from 1864 until the very end. This was the Leesburg Freight Station. This was built in the early 1890s, I believe. It's on the site of the original combination station, freight plus passengers, but it burned in the early 1890s. By that time, a separate passenger station had been built, so they just built a more modern freight station to just handle freight in Leesburg. And this is the passenger station, which was the 1880s, I believe. Okay. Clark's Gap was one of the original stations out at Route 9 and Route 7. Peony Springs, Bill. Hamilton was an original. Personville, this was built around 1901 or 2. The original station burned. We don't have any photos of the original station, but we just have kind of an outline of what the station looked like from the Southern Railway records. And this is Round Hill. The previous photo I said pre-1912 because there were no electric lines along the tracks. This is Round Hill when there are electric lines and the railway was electrified. And then Bluemont Station, this is the one that the townspeople helped to build around 1900. It later burned and a smaller, more modern station was built. In 1904, these two gentlemen got into the railroad business, sort of. John McLean owned the Washington Post. Senator Elkins was from West Virginia and had been involved with railroads there. They bought an authorized rail line that was going to run from Georgetown to Great Falls. And so they built the Great Falls and Old Dominion Railroad. It was planned as an excursion railroad. So people could get out of the city on the weekends, go up to the Great Falls. They had a dance hall, a restaurant, pavilions. You could rent tents and camp out. Eventually they had a merry-go-round. So it was kind of the thing to do in Washington during the summer. And it was very popular. I've read reports of the trains just being packed. People scrambling to try to get on. So they were successful, and they started looking around for other railroad business. This was one of their ads during the heyday of the Great Falls and Old Dominion. They had no malaria. And as railroads, metros kind of they engender development, and when the Great Falls and Old Dominion line was built, there weren't a lot of homes out that way. It was kind of undeveloped. But because now there was a way for people to travel, people started building homes along the Great Falls and Old Dominion. And this is a family who lived nearby, and they put up these little shelters so that people could just walk down to their local whistle stop, they called it, and flag down a train and ride into the city. When they built, the Great Falls and Old Dominion was an electric train. It was kind of the new technology Previously, you would have had probably a coal or wood-fired steam locomotive, which smelled, it was hot, it was dirty, particularly in the summer if you had to have the windows down on the passenger cars. So they electrified it. So in 1912, McLean and Elkins bought what we call the W&OD Railroad. At the time, it was still the Southern Railway Bluemont Branch. They named their company the Washington Old Dominion to take in both the W&OD and the Great Falls and Old Dominion. They set about electrifying the W&OD to take advantage of that new technology. They didn't have great electric locomotives at the time, though, to haul the heavy loads of freight. So they bought a couple of these coal-fired locomotives, and well, one got wrecked pretty quickly, and so there was just one running back and forth from Alexandria west. But these were the passenger trains that would run from Alexandria or Roslyn, because Roslyn now connected to the W&OD, and would run all the way to Bluemont. So these would be coming through Sterling every day, multiple trips, depending on, when they started out, they had many trips a day of passenger cars. That, as we're going to see, that dwindled quite rapidly. And by 1918, there were powerful electric locomotives available. So they bought some of those to haul their freight loads, and they got rid of the steam engine. And they even built their own electric locomotive. This was a boxcar that had been wrecked. So the engineers with the W&OD, they altered it, they put an electric engine in it, electric motor in it. They cut porthole windows in the side, no one knows why. It's probably the only locomotive in the United States that had portal windows like a ship. So it's very popular with model railroaders. I've seen so many versions of this. They also ran what they called the Loud Limited. It was a quick service to go from Georgetown to Bluemont. They didn't stop at every little whistle stop. They only stopped at the major stations. So you could get from Georgetown to Bluemont in a speedy 2 hours. And this is one of the hotels out in Bluemont. So this is where people would go to spend a week, sometimes even a month. Maybe mom and the kids would go out to Bluemont and stay. Dad would work in the city and come out on weekends. And in 1912, they even published this resort book, which listed every town along the line that had a bed and breakfast or an inn or a boarding house, and would list the prices, the amenities, things like that. This is one of the whistle stops. This one's out in Western Loudoun. So it's very typical of the kinds of little stations they had. Although all the photos we've seen of those things, and we even own one that came from Clark's Gap, that everyone was built differently. So it was either whichever carpenter was told to build it, did his own design, or maybe it was the same carpenter and he just wanted to do something different every time. The W&OD started running into trouble pretty quick. Their standards were pretty lax. The first thing that happened was Senator McLean passed away shortly after Senator Elkins passed away shortly after he and John McLean bought the railroad. John McLean ran it, but by 1916 he was dying from cancer, so there really was absentee ownership. So the standards weren't being enforced. There was no new capital money to repair things. Lots and lots of complaints were going to the state. It sparked many great, colorful names for the railroad. There's more than this, but I didn't have room, and some of them I can't really publish. One of the things that came to trouble the railroad were cars and roads. Cars got faster and more reliable, roads got better, more of them were being macadamized, asphalted. So people back then loved their cars just like we do. So rather than go to a train station and wait for a train, which probably is going to be late, they really wanted to just jump in their car and drive to the next town or go wherever they wanted to go. So passenger service started dropping off rapidly. The Great Depression didn't help. People didn't have the money to ride. So passenger service was dwindling, and eventually it did shut down. They tried to prop up passenger business by picking people up in neighborhoods and communities with a bus and taking them to the WNOD station. Kind of the same way Metro has done it by picking up people with their buses and taking them to the Metro stops. So that was nothing new. The demise of the railroad kind of started in the 30s. The town of Bluemont had some business. There was a big mill, flour mill, near the railroad station, and that kind of kept the end of the line in business. So it was still worth going to Bluemont for quite a long time. This was a trestle that was leading up to Round Hill. So this would have been built back in 1874. It was all wood. It was really starting to rot. It was very rickety. The inspections said it needed to be replaced. There was no money in the 1930s to replace it. The WNOD went through a bankruptcy in the mid-1930s. The heirs to McLean and Elkins did not want to put any more money into the railroad. Under the terms of the incorporation of the WNOD, their heirs could not sell the railroad. They were stuck with it. So they were just willing to let it sort of deteriorate. Okay. So by the 1930s, the end of the railroad from Purcellville West was chopped off. It was abandoned. The state approved the abandonment. The land was sold off to nearby farmers, whoever lived adjacent to the property. So Purcellville became the end of the line at that point. This is a map of the shortened WNOD. The railroad stopped passenger service in the early 1940s. It just was no longer worth it. At the same time they stopped passenger service, they got rid of the electric railroad equipment. It was pretty old at that point. It needed to be upgraded. There was no money to upgrade the electric equipment. So they essentially sold off all the wires and the equipment, and they bought all self-propelled equipment. So at this point it was just a freight railroad, so these are the typical freight locomotives they started using at that point. And freight was still a lucrative thing for the railroad. Every town had hardware stores, lumber yards, feedlots, a lot of agriculture that needed to run on the railroad. So they were able to actually make a little bit of money just by hauling freight. This is a scene down in Arlington of, well, let me back up 1 second. Mid-1940s, the World War II was going on. The railroad was not running passengers, but the federal government forced them to start passenger service again. So gas was scarce. They needed people who lived in the countryside of Virginia to get to jobs in DC. So they bought a number of different types of self-propelled equipment. So gas, electric passenger cars, diesel electric passenger cars. This is one of them. So they would, they opened their railroad stations back up for passenger service, and they started running these trains. This is another example of a couple of This was a couple of freight locomotives pulling some box cars down in Arlington. After the war, they picked up a couple of these locomotives. They were World War II surplus. And they were always kind of scrounging for used equipment anytime they could, because they just couldn't afford to buy all new stuff. Okay, keep going. After the war, they continued passenger service with the self-propelled vehicles, but after the war, once gas became plentiful again, passenger service dropped again. People got back in their cars, and they didn't want to ride the trains. So this photo was actually taken on the last day of passenger service, May 31st, 1951. That was the most packed the passenger cars had been for a very long time, because everybody wanted to ride the very last passenger train on the W&OD. The fellow who took this picture was from Ontario, Canada. He was a railroad buff, and he had read about the passenger service stopping in a trains magazine. So he rode a train down to Northern Virginia so he could ride the last train. And he gave us his photos, his slides, so we have some really great shots of him. And the guy in the suit is in every one of those photos, but he doesn't know who he is. He just jumped in front of every picture. One of the things that caused the passenger service to stop in 1951 was the W&OD lost their mail contract. The trains had these mail sections, and they would take the mail in at each town, they would sort it, and then drop it off to be sent to the regional post offices. And they lost the contract because a trucking company, I guess probably got a low bid. And so there was just, the mail contract was propping up the passenger service at that time. There's another photo from that last train. There were still a number of freight customers, Bowman Distillery. There were still some mills, lumber mills, flour mills, hardware stores, things like that. Gravel was, the quarries were good customers. Okay. This was a quarry out near Leesburg. The railroad, because they had not upgraded equipment, they really didn't maintain the line as well as they should have. They started having accidents. In this case, the tracks were probably so old, and when the trains running over the steel tracks heats them up, the more it heats them up, they become brittle, and they're more prone to breaking. And that's what happened here. The tracks broke, it derailed the train, the cars, and it fell over. There were a number of accidents like this. They also didn't maintain their culverts the way they should have. There were many, many creeks that ran underneath the tracks, and they just were in simple little stone boxes that they built. And they had to be maintained, and this one wasn't. The water started to get behind the stone wall, and it caused it to collapse. And where there were creeks along the way, they would wash out the embankments, and you'd have landslides like this. Probably the biggest problem, though, for the railroad was traffic. Even in the 1960s, like this photo shows, it was harder and harder for the trainmen to get their train across roads, stay on schedules. Typically, what they had to do was they would come up to a busy road, they would stop, the brakeman would get out with a little stop paddle and try to stop the cars. And people didn't want to stop. They were busy. They wanted to get somewhere. So they had a lot of trouble stopping cars on these busy highways. And sometimes when people tried to beat the train, there were accidents. In this case, this is Shirley Highway, which is now 395 in the Arlington area. and a driver of an asphalt truck tried to beat the train across, and instead hit the locomotive, threw that heavy locomotive into the nearby creek, and the truck was just totally smashed. This is a scene down in Alexandria. This is what became known as Potomac Yards. It's not there anymore, but it was a large interchange between trains running north and south, and in this case, the W&OD went right across there.
What year is that, approximately?
This was mid-1960s. When the railroad shut down many years later, this became extremely valuable property because the W&OD Railroad owned a 100-foot swath all the way through Potomac Yards. And when that was developed, the new owner had a lot of leverage to sell that property and sell it for a pretty expensive price.
It's now Crystal City, Roslyn and Crystal City.
So this was that same scene at Lee Highway. This was one of the last straws in the life of the railroad. The highway department wanted the railroad company to build a bridge over the highway because there were accidents and there were slowdowns from the trains crossing. The railroad company didn't want to spend the money. They wanted the road bridged over them. So they kind of stared at each other for a number of years. But eventually the railroad in 1968 was abandoned. It had been coming for a while. It did take a little while to go through the processes that railroads have to go through to be abandoned because it's not in the public interest to lose your railroads. But where the railroad is no longer economically feasible, then sometimes they would grant the abandonment. So in the early 1970s, the Northern Virginia Regional Park Authority became interested in this abandoned railroad. It had been bought by Dominion Power as soon as the railroad shut down. There were power lines along the way. But we could see that a trail would be very popular that potentially could run from Alexandria to Western Loudoun. So after many years of negotiation in 1978, what's now called Nova Parks bought the entire line and started building the trail. It took us till 1988 to get all the way to Percival. And every step of the way, people kept asking, when are you going to keep building more? Because it was so popular. Cyclists wanted to get out and bike even further. So now it's 45 miles long. I don't know how many horses are on the trail, the horse trail anymore, but lots of people hike on it and run on it. And about 2 million people a year use it. And I threw in a couple slides of the books that David brought with him today. This is the first one David wrote, and the one previously we both collaborated on. I did one chapter, the transition to a park from the river. I think that's all.
Do any of the trains still exist? I mean, anybody in an antique museum or something?
Not in museums that I know of. There's one out in Iowa, one of the old electric freight locomotives, and it's not really in use much anymore, and it's painted bright orange.
Just one?
Just one.
Wow.
And I don't know of any other equipment that still exists. Rumors are that one of the locomotives got sent down to South America, and it's possible it's still there, but no one has ever found it.
Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't one of the last tasks that the railroad did was bringing gravel to build Dulles Airport? So that was pretty significant.
They hauled gravel to build the Beltway. They didn't haul gravel for the airport, they hauled sand.
Same, okay.
So the sand that went into building the runways and foundations and all came up the W&OD. I think David's going to talk about that more.
What does it mean to be self-propelled?
it has its own motor, so it didn't run off. It had its own way of generating electricity.
It was like a gas engine?
So it had a gas engine or a diesel engine, which just like a Chevy Volt, when it has a battery, but when the battery runs down, it has a little engine that charges the battery back up. Those self-propelled cars had a gas or diesel engine that generated electricity and drove the thing. Let me switch over.
This is an aerial photograph about 1937. Unfortunately, it looks like the screen got cut off a little bit here, but Sterling is over in this little part of the picture. This is Church Road. This one goes down to Holly Avenue. And Sterling Boulevard would be up here. This is the road. You get into that one, maybe that's Church Road. This one's Holly Avenue. This is Church Road here. Here's the railroad. Somebody asked me where the station was. The station's right here. It's Alexander Fertilizer Company. I'm thinking that building might still exist. I'll show you some pictures later to give you my thoughts on why it still exists. But then we've got the mill, the cattle pen, little, I read what that's in. But anyway,
Toilet. It says toilet.
oil house maybe? A toilet. That's one thing about the stations at this time. They didn't have toilets, didn't have running water, so the outhouse was out back somewhere.
So is this over by the Ruritan?
This Ruritan, back one side. The Ruritan road is right in here, so it's right next to the station.
So that would be Ruritan Road on the left,
This would be, yeah, that'd be,
Old Church
well, the
Road.
Ruritan Road runs this way. This would be Old Church Road. I wish that slide had shown better. All right, go ahead, next. All right, Paul talked about the railroad being cut up during the Civil War. This once view slide I came across in my searches showing the burned bridge during the Civil War. To give you some idea of the amount of destruction that was, impacted the railroad. Also why it was difficult to repair it. This particular picture was hung at Green's funeral home. That's where I made a copy of it from there. One of the things that, in my research, I talked to the Bixler family, the Gene Bixlers and the Martin Bixlers. Mrs. Martin Bixler was a station agent here for a number of years, and one thing she told me was that, like Paul mentioned earlier about the Express and UPS, FedEx type service, well, she said that extra money that she got from doing the handling the Express that came off the train made a difference in her family budget, and it was important to her. Now, one of the things about the railroad that also kind of interesting was that many families were involved in the railroad, but many members of the families were also involved. So while Mrs. Bixler was a station agent here, later her husband Martin was a station agent in Vienna. Her brothers-in-law Norman and Jean were express messengers on the train, and they would run the express portion. They had extra freight compartment in the passenger trains where the express would be handled. And they would be stationed in there kind of like an express or FedEx driver today, and he had his own little compartment that he handled the express out of. So we had the two brothers there, and then David Bixler was the father of the brothers. David Bixler was the manager of the substation in Leesburg. So it was just one family. There's some other families that Paul probably knows more than I do at the moment that were also cousins and brothers that worked for the railroad.
What year, do you know, this picture was taken?
Well, I don't see any wires, so maybe 1900s, early 1900s. The next ball. Okay, I believe it's interesting is you got the wire still up, so that means that this picture was taken before 1941. You got the station probably been burned down, so now it's replaced with a passenger shelter. There's the cattle pens that were mentioned earlier and shown on the map. We have this Alexander Fertilizer building, and then the mill back behind it. And what strikes me interesting in this building right here is the particular shape of that. And later on, I think it was the Southern States building. And to my way of thinking, this building might still be there today. It's just, you know, white paint, and it's being used for, well, it was empty today pretty much. It had some flooring type materials in it, but it wasn't really open for business. Of course, that would have been, okay, all right. Paul had already showed you a train, so well, of course, just a quick one, this is a tower for the mill in Beaumont, and it's the third tower there. The previous two ones, actually might be the fourth one. The previous ones had been built of wood, and they burned down, so they had to finally figure out that concrete might not burn down so fast. Okay, here's some pictures of what I believe is a mill in Sterling. Back here is the same building that Alexander Fertilizer Company, and the white building that's existing today. There were mills on the railroad all the way from Herndon all the way out to Beaumont. Almost every town had a mill. There were only the two flour mills on the line. The rest of them were feed mills. It would be where they bring in grain and other items, maybe molasses, to mix into the feed, and then bag it and sell it to the farmers. Farmers could bring, if they were growing grain, they could bring it in and have it shipped out. And then this is also a dairy farming area in eastern Loudoun County. And so, let me see the next picture. Kind of the same view with this one's now 1968. Of course, in addition to the receiving the grain, they had to have a place to store the grain, a place to mix the grain. And the Loudoun mill today still mixes grain for the farmers, and they told me out there that the miller would also do custom mixes with the grain if somebody wanted particularly more sorghum or more wheat or more oats, that the mill would mix according to what they wanted. Okay, next. Okay, trying to show a little bit of location. This is the track side. Of course, the road side's on the back. The awning is shown on the back side here with the tracks. Just trying to show you the location of the mill. Well, one thing about mills was that it's a very tough business because it has to be based on volume. You want to buy your grain, you have to pay the farmer a good price, or so he'll come to you and bring the grain to you. But then you can't pay him too much because you've got to make money on it yourself. And then you're in competition with the other mills down the line because they also want to get pay the farmers less so they make more profit, but they have to pay them more so they get the grain come to them. So it was tough to balance out just where your price would be. And then they sell the grain to businesses in Baltimore. Okay. Dick Tavener was the miller for many years here at this mill. It was operated until 1934, and the building finally burned down in 1970. And this is the front side of the structure. This would be Raritan Road, right here. Next. I didn't touch on it too much, but one of the things that kept the railroad passenger service going was the railway post office. The railroad provided an actual post office in the car here. The railway post office clerk was a civil employee, was not a railroad employee. They received their mail from the Washington Main Post Office in Washington, D.C., be brought in by truck, and loaded onto the train here, like in Roslyn. And they run, take pouches. I think the last train had received like 51 pouches of mail. It seemed like a lot of mail that they were giving up on their contract. And the clerk would sort the mail en route, get it bagged for the different towns along the way. And in addition to just running to the towns along the railroad, they'd also had pouches of mail that they would just drop off at different towns that would be taken offline. So you'd go to Oakland's with pouches of mail, or Waterford, or Arcola, or Taylorstown would get mail from the railroad, or at least partially delivered from the railroad, and it'd be taken out by the local contractors. Now, Ashburn and Herndon were drop-off points for these types of pouches. Unfortunately, Sterling was not large enough that it didn't serve as a distribution point for these. Okay, next. After the electric service ended in 1941, the railroad still had its mail contract, so it took the mail car here, took the motors out because they didn't need them anymore, couldn't use them. And then they pulled it with a diesel-electric locomotive up and down the line. And probably one of the very few operations we'd have this small basically a mail train with two cars. Another thing about this was the last operating trolley railway post office on the East Coast. Okay, next. I've got some. This shows an interior of a combination car which had both a freight section and a passenger section. The front section here, I believe, was a smoking section. It's divided. We got some nail cabinets in the front, where the freight section was of the car. The railway post office would have had a whole section devoted to it, which was about 15 feet long, devoted to the sorting tables, and the racks were putting together the pouches. Okay, next. This is, I believe, May 30th, 1951, or May 31st. Either way, towards the end of the rail service with the mail, got the mail truck backed up to the car. Difficult to see here, but was a little hole inside where folks could drop their letters for the to be sent on the train into town. We got the usual crew of rail fans taking advantage of the last run. Okay. There's the Sterling Supply Company in 1956. I believe at one time it became Southern States structure because of the shape of the roof.
That building was built in '55 by George Page. So that was his new warehouse when he got the Southern States. He got the Southern States franchise in '54. And apparently he managed that building until '72.
Okay, I was thinking it looked a lot like an Alexander Fertilizer Company.
And then that's what, grinding equipment on the top there?
But yeah, we have some sort of dust collector.
Apparently he did all that in the early '50s, so
Okay.
I believe that is the last building. That's the building that you see out there today.
Right. And it had the siding, at this time siding went up this way, with the main line here.
Right, right, and that's right, not far from where Ruritan Circle, it's really on the corner of Ruritan Circle and Ruritan Road.
Okay, I guess this is Ruritan Circle back here.
I gather so, yeah. It looks a lot different now.
I think that's Ruritan Road and Ruritan Circle's in the foreground.
Oh, this? I thought this was Church Road or something.
Well, it used to be Church Road. When they realigned Church Road after the railroad shut down,
Right.
they called this the Circle.
Oh, okay.
And the tracks are still in the asphalt.
All right, next. Okay, the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad purchased the railroad in 1955 in hopes of well, Davis and Elkins family wanted to get rid of the property because they just wasn't making any money for them, and they, needed to sell it, get out from underneath their, will. They prevented them from selling it. Casino bought it. They hope to put more industry on the line. In particular, they hope to serve a power plant located up here in Loudoun County, up where the Algonquian Park is now. The railroad purchased the land around it, which became Cascades. As a part of the effort, the railroad improved the bridges. You can see that this is a pretty light bridge, probably left over from the 1800s. It wouldn't carry a heavy coal car today. So the railroad replaced the bridge. This one, as long as several others. This particular bridge here is a broad run, just a little bit west of here. This pier is still there, of course. The abutments are still there too. Right. Next. The railroad was poor, so they had to replace the bridges pretty much with as little contract labor as possible and as little machinery as possible. So one of the things they did here was they brought the new girder up on the old railroad line, on the old tracks, propped it up on each end, took the tracks out from underneath it, and built a crib of ties to hold it up. And then they very slowly take the crib out from underneath this pier, underneath this girder bridge, and drop the girder down into place. And I can put the ties back on and the track back on. They did one bridge, one span at a time, maybe over 2 weekends to do that.
By then, was that all metal? It looks like metal rather than wood. Underneath?
There's a wood cribbing here.
But the X's.
Metal there, and just some metal, of course.
The X's is that metal or wood? The X's.
This is metal, yes.
Yeah, okay, good. Worried me.
This part is the old part. That's the part that they took out. Okay, next. All right. Paul mentioned the Dulles Airport. When the Dulles Airport was being built, the railroad installed this one yard here to transfer sand from the hopper cars into the trucks. The hopper cars loaded up here. They pull them through. They've got a little shaker here to shake the sand, make sure it comes out loose. The dump truck would back up underneath the hopper car to be loaded, then it'd drive on down to the airport. There was some talk about running a spur down to the airport, but I think the railroad decided it wasn't worth the money I don't know, perhaps to buy the property and build a railroad. It just wasn't worth it for them to do it. Then there was the discussion between Loudoun County and Maryland. Maryland needed a power plant to serve their residences and businesses, and they were basically the plant was being built for them, and they decided that they really pushed Pepco to put the plant in Maryland because it was going to be generating a lot of property taxes. Loudoun County at one point was happy and really was looking forward to having perhaps $100 million worth of property taxes from the coal company and the power plant come into their coffers, but Maryland convinced Pepco to put the plant over in Dickerson. So one of the major reasons for the C&O to own the WNOD went away. All right, next, another view of the Southern Supply Company. You can see the tracks here going back into the main line. Again, our two freight diesels pulling the train east.
So that train's coming east?
Yeah, it's eastbound. Coming, yeah. Paul is west.
And so that road right there that the train is crossing is Road 10 Circle?
I guess, is that right, Paul?
Today it's Rotan Circle. Back then it was part of Church Road.
Yeah, at this point it'd be Church Road, then I guess Church Road was realigned.
Yeah,
And then they built a
1965
bridge over the
is
trail.
written out.
Yeah, where the photographer's standing, the train tracks go into a deep cut, and so the Church Road couldn't navigate that, so it diverted down to this lower section. But when the railroad shut down 68, VDOT filled that cut and straightened Church Road out, and then they renamed this Rotan Circle.
Last. I'm not sure, this house might still be standing, there's another picture, just in case the train is running, pulling the train.
And where is that?
Still in Sterling.
Would that be Mona's Cafe?
No.
No.
Do you recognize that?
One thing, like Paul mentioned, there's a number of places on the railroad where the local road had to do a funny bend to get over the tracks because of the way the grades were. Like in Herndon, the train, the Eldon Street went down and curved right next to the station before continuing on because of the cut to the east of the Herndon station. Here, again, the cut was to the east of the station. In Falls Church, there are a couple places where the road went over the right-of-way. It was pretty steep, pretty hard turns to get across the right-of-way. Okay. Any questions or?
Yes, I have a question.
Okay.
So in regards to what actually happened, say, in the 30s or 40s in Sterling, basically it was just a mill there and milling equipment. But there was never, it doesn't appear that there's a whole lot of history to the railroad in Sterling. Those pictures that you showed, I've never seen before. There's very few pictures that I've been able to find on any activity in Sterling. So, to the best of your knowledge, what took place there? There was no railroad, locomotive repair. It was strictly a...
The only thing I'm aware of would be those couple of businesses, the fertilizer plant, the mill, the Southern States, or the fireplace. That's all I know of it being in Sterling. Of course, the express business and the mail business, they would drop off, take the pouches of mail from the train over to the post office. I'm not sure where the post office was at that time.
The post office at that time was right on the old Church Road.
Okay.
We had pictures of somebody hauling a wagon of mail to the post office that was established like in the 40s.
Right.
It stayed a post office till the early 60s.
Yeah, I think his name is Billy, but I don't remember his last
Yeah,
name.
there was one dated 1957, it was the last mail ran, May 31st, 1957.
But he's saying 51 they stopped the mail.
Yeah, mail service stopped May 31st, 1951.
So I think that was
By
a mistake.
the
Or maybe
train.
it was a mistake on the picture.
Yeah, we have a picture with the 57 date, but I think it really was 51, like you're saying.
I've got both of my books here for sale tonight. I've got this is the first edition, and the second edition, which Paul contributed a chapter to.
Yes.
Yeah, there was a question earlier about rail cars, and there is an old rail car at the Bluemont Community Center in the back lot. I don't know what the vintage of the car is, or if it's even one of the cars that travels on this line, but there is an old car there.
So there's caboose at Bluemont Junction on the park there. Now, I'm not sure what you see. Is it actually in Bluemont?
At the community center in the back behind the
No,
building.
I'm not familiar with that one.
Is it a caboose?
Good question,
I think I've seen it. Years ago, railroads no longer were required to have a caboose at the end of their trains. So the railroads had all these cabooses and nothing to use them for. So particularly the RF&P were looking to get rid of them, and they would give them away. If you could get it there, they'll give it to you. So there's one in Arlington at Bluemont Junction, Bluemont Park. There's one in Vienna near the station on WNOD property, and there's one in Herndon. Same thing, it's near the station on Nova Park's property. and they never ran on the WNOD. The WNOD had a couple cabooses, but the only photos I've seen of them are they're sitting in the brush decaying. By the time the photos were taken, they were no longer in use. So
And this one in Blumont's not been restored.
it's not part of it's not part of the WNOD. So in mentioning what the gentleman asked about what really happened historically around Sterling, it really was identical to what was happening in most of the towns, only on a much smaller scale. So there were plenty of farms around, say up until the 1950s, 60s maybe. So they would be bringing their farm products to the station. There were probably cattle farmers that brought their cattle to the station. It's just Leesburg was bigger. They had a whole stockyard that they built for the cattle. Most smaller stations like Sterling would have had just a little pen. So Balch Library does have a ledger book from the Sterling station, and I can't remember the year of it. It was quite old. I think it was post-Civil War, like late 1860s, early 70s. But it listed what was being brought in and what was being shipped out. It was kind of interesting. I looked through it. It was kind of page after page of the same thing. A lot of salt fish got brought into Sterling in the late 1860s. That was, I guess it was plentiful. You know, the ships were bringing it in to the docks in Alexandria. It was being processed, and it was being sold by the barrel out into the countryside. A lot of whiskey was coming in and out back then. That was a commodity that was valuable. So, and then every other farm product you can imagine: butter, milk, corn, wheat, just the typical Virginia farm products. Any other questions?
Where was the junction of the line that went from Roslyn to Great Falls and the WNOD? Where did they meet?
There are two junctions, one in Bluemont, which is at Wilson Boulevard, and 4 Mile Run. And the second one is up at Thrifton, which is now Lyons Village, Route 29, and close to Spout Run Parkway. The one at Lyons Village was the junction between the line from Roslyn to Great Falls. The Elkins and McLean built a branch, which they call the Spout Run Division, from Lyons Village down to Bluemont Junction to connect the two railroads so that they could operate them as one. I've got a WNOD Yahoo group if anybody's interested. A lot of knowledgeable folks on that group that can answer more questions if you have more questions about the railroad. I've got the 2 books out. Our collection, public collection of WNOD materials is over at the Aldie Museum. Even though it is a mill museum, it's still, that's where the collection is.
There's also a Washington Old Dominion Railroad Facebook page, and there's lots of old photos, people scouring the libraries, and some from our collection with Nova Parks have been loaded there. So just all kind of odds and ends, but you might find it interesting if you want to look at that.
When did VEPCO put up what used to be VEPCO, when did they put up the high tension lines? Because I noticed the one picture had it, you could see the high tension towers.
About 1964. It went up before the railroad was abandoned. It was one of the, I guess, the good things for the railroad. They sold that for quite a few bucks. And there's a little court case came down later, and the park went out and said, VEPCO has the aerial easement. Thank you very much. That's all you have. So everything's underground is now park property. So it's, the park makes money off the railroad.
Any other questions?
Yeah, are these pictures available somewhere else other than Facebook or whatever? Is there a WNOD online site?
There's no complete collection online. All the photos that we collected with Nova Parks have been digitized, and we have them sort of within the park computers. When people ask for collections, say somebody might want to know do you have any photos of Sterling? Usually what I do is I will put together a folder of all the photos that might interest them, and then I give them a link, and then they can download. The 2,300 or so photos of the railroad we have in the Nova Parks collection were all donated by, mostly donated by old railroad men, collectors, people who just took photos years ago and then later were glad to hear that someone was interested in the railroad. And I kept pretty busy for a lot of years scanning and duplicating people's photos. We only got a couple of originals. We started buying some off eBay when collections came up. But mostly people just loaned us their photos, and we made negatives and prints, and then later we did scans. So we kind of consider them part of the history of Northern Virginia, and we share them freely.
You know, we would be very interested in the pictures of the Sterling Supply and the railroad track there. It's an area that some people in the community are trying to restore in some way, and there's just very few pictures of that you have. The mill pictures, I think the mill burned down in '71, and many of the buildings were burned in controlled fires by the fire department. But that one Sterling Supply, built in '55, we don't have any old pictures like that. I found that very interesting.
I'll send a link, and you can download them for the group.
Thank you so much. So while Neil is setting up, I wanted to ask, are there any teachers here tonight? Okay. I wish there were. Please go out and let people know in your neighborhoods and the community what we are doing here. You know, there's a lot of history that's happening. You know, as we stand and sit here, we are making history. But many students today know nothing about history. They're just given a glimpse. I've oftentimes looked at curriculums from various areas because I have a background in education, and you'd be surprised how little they really know about history. And I think it really stems from you know, the ground up. It's good for them to know the history of where they live. And if we were to be able to pass this information on to those in elementary school, the middle schools, and in high school, that would be just awesome for them to know what happened here before, you know, they saw the asphalt and the shopping centers, to get a glimpse of what their community was like. So I'm going to pass these around. If you'd like to give a donation, I'm thinking, as you know, the guys were talking, that maybe we could get enough money to buy some books and put them in the library here. And we'd like to get an endeavor going in the next year where we're actually going into the schools and talking to the kids about their Sterling history from as far back as you know, we can go. I wanted to also mention something about the electrification of the railroad. I don't know how many of you know this, but back in 1939, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as part of his initiative, his grand initiative, had the Rural Electrification Initiative. And it was to have electricity, have the farms be illuminated by electricity. And the World Conference of 1939 happened in Washington, D.C. So people from all around the world came to D.C. And the conference actually bused people to Sterling, or sent them out on the railroad to Sterling, to see the farm in Sterling, which is around the area of Briar Patch Park. And it was one of the farms there that was actually electrified, and one of the first farms in the country that had electrification. So I wanted to mention that to you. I'm passing around the membership form for the Sterling Foundation, but if anyone has not signed in, you can just see me after the meeting and I'll add your name to the list if you'd like to get notifications on what we're doing. And I want to recognize a couple of other people who are in the audience with us tonight. Cheryl Villalobos, who is chairman of the Sterling Foundation, our host group. interested in helping with stream cleanup or Sterling Fest or any of the other foundation endeavors, Sterling will be around, or go onto the website. Pat Turner is sitting right behind Cheryl, and Pat is the founder of Bike Loudon. And correct me if I'm wrong, but are you coming up on 10-year anniversary for Bike Loudon?
Yeah.
10-year anniversary this year, right?
And I'm also president of the Friends of the WNOD Trail.
Exactly, and Pat hails from Sterling, if I remember correctly. Yes? You still live in Sterling?
I live in Sterling.
Great. Oh, you still, okay, great. And Jackie Anderson and Bill Ewing have an endeavor going on in the Old Sterling area, previously known as Guilford, to try to save some of the remaining buildings that are there. Our group had a series, or we didn't host, but we helped to present a series of talks last year where we got the business owners together of Old Sterling, and they actually created a plan for what Old Sterling would look like if a developer could come in and put in some really nice shops and try to preserve some of the buildings. So if you are interested in that effort, see, you know, Todd or me or Mark or Jackie or Bill on that, because that's a really cool initiative. And I'll just mention also that I got a call from Chris Phillips from Connemara Woods. He's on the board of directors there. If you like that beautiful wooded setting along Potomac View Road, which connects to Clodmore Park, there is some interest by developers to take that all down and to put in some high-density kind of residential there. So if you're interested in getting in touch with Chris, you can see me after the meeting, and I can put you in touch with Chris. And I think that's all the announcements that I have, and I'll hand it over now to Neil.
Just having a few
Are there
technical
any
difficulties.
questions?
Having a few technical difficulties.
Oh, okay.
Passing over the
Do
computer.
y'all have
so
any questions
you need to
about
spread.
what we do, or the community, or, you know?
What was the last thing you said about high density somewhere? I didn't catch that.
Okay, if you know Potomac View Road, let's say if you're on Route 7 and you're heading south on Potomac View Road, so that the Hearst Heater would be on your right. So you're going down what pretty much looks like a rural road, and the Connemara Woods community would be on your left. If you go up that road to the left, it's pretty much trees all the way down to Cascades Parkway. And behind all those trees is Clodmore Park. That area that sits along Potomac View Road to the east, it is owned by the Carrata family. Dr. Carrata was a surgeon, I think, with Georgetown, and he has since retired and he lives on one of the islands. And some of the developers are looking at developing all that land and putting in some high-density residential there.
Is that where the farm is and the pond
Yeah.
and all that?
Yes, yes.
A seniors center, I believe. The retirement home is one of
Would
them.
be built on the other side. There's, oh, yes, correct. The senior center on Route 7, the back of it sits along their frontage, yes. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, enjoy.
All righty, well, thank you very much, Helena. My name is Neil V. Stern, and unlike my co-presenters, Paul and David, I'm not a published author, and I'm not a person that gives presentations. In fact, this is my first presentation ever.
We're listening.
In fact, I only came into this knowing about Vestals Gap Road from working over at Clodmore Recreation Center. I actually teach and coach swimming at Clodmore Rec Center. I work in Fairfax and in Arlington. But I am a history buff. I'm very interested in history. And I'm very interested in historic preservation. I am like most of you out there. I'm just somebody that discovered this resource in our midst that is fast disappearing. Old Vestals Gap Road. So I assume you guys are all here because you know about Vestals Gap Road, or you've heard of it? Okay, is there anyone that hasn't heard of Vestals Gap Road? Vestals Gap Road, Paul, please. Vestals Gap Road. Well, what is Old Vestals Gap Road? Actually, it's better to start by saying what was Vestals Gap Road. It was one of the earliest English roads in the Virginia colony. It was a very important road traveling west for about 70 miles in its heyday, perhaps even farther. And it started out as an Indian trail used by the, at the time of the interaction with the English, it was used by the Piscataway people who had a stronghold on Conway Island, up just around the bend north of Sterling on the Potomac. And it was the only road in the northern part of the colony for a very long time, at least the only one traveling west, and was first mentioned in literature in the 1690s, first in 1692 and then in 1699. It was used by George Washington, especially when he would go to visit Lord Fairfax in Winchester, and most notably during the French and Indian Wars. He used it along with members of Braddock's army. But it is a road that still exists in places and little traces. Let's go ahead and talk about the history of it. So, like I said, it started out as a Native American path, and most of those Native American paths actually followed animal trails, and mostly they were located on high points of ground, ridges, sometimes near water. And so is the case with Vestals Gap Road. It started as an animal path on high ridge of land that was used by different tribes, the Piscataway during the time of David Strahan, but others most likely before that, perhaps for hundreds of years. We don't really know. Lieutenant David Strahan was a commander of the Rangers of the Potomac, who were charged by the governor in Jamestown with dealing with not just the natives and skirmishes and what they termed Indian mischief back in those days, but also with pirates. There was a lot of piracy in the Chesapeake Bay. But David Strahan kept a journal, unlike a lot of guys. He actually wrote about his experiences in the woods and traveling and finding what they called the Indian tracts. They used the word tract, referring to the trail. And he was sent to go deal with a skirmish. I guess the Piscataway people had kidnapped someone, apparently. And there was a lot of that going on. The relationships with the natives were very complex. It wasn't just people, the natives raiding settlements. They had for the ones that spoke English, the natives, and some of the Indians, some of the English were able to learn some of the native languages. So there was a bit of communication going on at this time. And Strahan kept a record of his travels, and he mentions the path traveling over Difficult Run, Sugarland Run, and Broad Run, which was the actual Vestals Gap Road as it came to be. 7 years later, when the new government moved from Jamestown to Williamsburg, Governor Nicholson sent a couple of guys who were actually members of the court Giles Vandercastle and Burr Harrison to go out and spy on the Piscataway people and learn what their trading habits were, who their trading partners were, how many bowmen they had, what their fort looked like, you know, if they had any other cabins in the area. And they as well were charged with keeping detailed records. So we have records of Vestals Gap Road, of this path that traveled through the woods, that was a Native American path, and then began to be used by the English. Started with David Strahan, you can see his account, and I don't have that, unfortunately, I didn't have that, but you can Google Strahan and the Ranges of the Potomac, and that will come up. Vandercastle and Burr Harrison traveled 70 miles, kept detailed records. Again, encountered the same crossings at Sugar Land, that Difficult Run. In fact, we get the name Difficult Run from Vandercastle and Harrison's account, where they described crossing the water with their horses as being very difficult. So that record you can look onto. I actually have a link on, I have a website that I created. I actually got into doing this, investigating this, because I was taking a course, I was taking a class, and created a website like tons of teenagers that go to North Virginia Community College. And I wanted to be a writer, so I was taking writing courses. And I created this website. And I've got a link, and it's Old Vestals Gap Road, traces of our history. And I've got a link to that account of Vandercastle and Burr Harrison. In 1702, I don't know if you guys know about Colonel Robert Carter, very, very wealthy landowner, owned like half of the colony, and most of the northern neck. In 1702, he became the agent for the northern neck, and was trying to promote the what they called the Great Inland Movement of people. At that time, at the turn of the 17th and 18th centuries, settlement in the colony, at least the manor houses or any community, was always south of the falls lines of the two major rivers in the north, the Potomac and the Rappahannock. So, because they couldn't travel up beyond the falls, you know, anybody who managed to go inland using using the Vestals Gap, you know, were homesteaders or you know, people that were pioneers. So Colonel Carter was trying to get more of the population to move north of the falls line, so they used this road, and then they started to actually create more paths. There was in 1662, there was a move to create roads throughout the colony. So there was a little bit of that already happening, but not above the falls lines of the Rappahannock and Potomac rivers. So basically, Old Vestals Gap Road was the only one there. But with the inland movement instigated by Carter, more people started to move out there. And then in 1722, and I don't have that mentioned here, the lieutenant governor of the colony of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood, before he left office, he was the lieutenant governor from 1710 to 1722. One of his last acts before he left office was to sign a treaty with the Iroquois Indians, sort of pushing their settlements back beyond the Blue Ridge and the Shenandoah, and opening up settlement for the English. And of course, Spotswood was the lieutenant governor. The actual governor of the colony was a very elderly gentleman, was too old to make the voyage over on the ship. So the young lieutenant governor, Spotswood, came over, and he really instituted a lot of things here that shaped the colony for the next 100 years. One of them was that treaty. At that point, 1722 also, about the same time, a gentleman came down from Pennsylvania, John Vestal, and I believe his son started operating a ferry across the Shenandoah River. And it was right at the gap in the Blue Ridge Mountains where the trail pretty much ended. Beyond, there were other little trails beyond that, which is what the eventually General Braddock and Sir Peter Halkett and others were able to use during the French and Indian Wars in the 1750s to continue on to Fort Duquesne near modern-day Pittsburgh. Truro Parish and the Old Falls Church were also on Vestals Gap Road. Troops from both sides in the Revolutionary War, the English and the Americans, used Vestals Gap Road. There's documentation of that. And then in 1814, very famously, some of the White House treasures were rescued and hustled out of Washington and to Leesburg for safekeeping via Vestals Gap Road as well. I was just reading before we started that I thought maybe the famous Gilbert Stuart portrait of Washington that hung in the White House, I thought that was one of the things, but apparently it was some other things. That went somewhere in Maryland. But it was used by many people. James Madison, James Monroe, both of them are known to have used Vestals Gap Road. In 1825, General Lafayette came back over on the 50th anniversary, just before the 50th anniversary of the Revolutionary War. As an elderly gentleman, he came back over, made the journey across to celebrate the 50th anniversary. I don't know, you guys know about that? Yeah, and he was known to have used Vestals Gap Road as well. Anyway, long story short, it has a ton of history. It was used by so many people, most notably George Washington. And what eventually started the decline and the disappearance of Old Vestals Gap Road was the opening of the Leesburg Turnpike in 1825. That was a paved road, which was, big new technology at the time. And and just a couple miles to the north of Vestals Gap Road. Vestals Gap Road actually, in places, was coterminous with 7, when 7 was built, and actually crosses it in a couple places. But once the Leesburg Turnpike came into being, traffic on Vestals Gap Road dropped significantly. Early accounts from the 18th century mention, I think one of them is James Madison makes mention of using the road and having to turn around and head back and go on this detour because of the mud. So very quickly, people stopped using it. It was still used by farmers and locals, and was even used during the Civil War to march troops on to up to Gettysburg. And that was just to keep them off of Route 7, keep them off the turnpike, just so that movements couldn't be noticed, because it was still fairly wooded. Oh, thanks, David. What's in the name? So over its long history, from the close of the 1600s up until the dawn of the 19th century, it had many of these names. And it was George Washington himself who used this name, the Great Road. The Potomac Path, the Eastern Ridge Road, the road to Vestals Gap, and then Vestals Gap itself in the 19th century, or in the late 18th, came to be called Keys Gap. So at a certain point it was called Keys Gap Road. And Old Vestals Gap Road, the old in front of it, is actually thanks to our beloved park employee, Meredith Breed. I don't know if anybody knew Meredith Breed. Yeah.
Yes.
she was just wonderful. She helped me with all my research. She knew everything that there is to know about what I'm going to talk about here in a minute, the remaining sections of Old Vestals Gap Road. There are several sections that still exist that are not being maintained or cataloged by VDOT. It was Meredith Breed who got them to name Vestals Gap Road, Old Vestals Gap Road, that little section here at Claude Park. Has everybody been to that? The section at Claude Park, she was like a big part of that happening. And she is the one that got them to name it Old Vestals Gap Road, because apparently a developer somewhere else near Herndon named a street Vestals Gap Road. And apparently, and I've looked at this with satellite imagery and everything, and it's not Vestals Gap Road. I mean, it's very unlikely that it was a portion of it. And so, because of that, she had to call it Old Vestals Gap Road. But anyway, yeah, we'll move on to the next one. So where is it? It originally ran, and I apologize for not having a map. It originally ran from just below Hunting Creek, but I do have a map I'll show you in a minute. It's a topo map. It ran from Hunting Creek, just south of modern-day Alexandria, to Vestals Gap in the Shenandoah Valley, not too far from Winchester. And it was, again, the only main road that traveled above the falls lines of the Potomac and the Rappahannock. And again, the only people that ventured above that were like, loners, pioneered, not families of people, and certainly no communities. At that time, settlements were just like an individual person or family settling. It wasn't an actual community or township. And the extant remains that we have today are mostly in the 20164, 20165 zip code areas. So next slide. So here's me at Riverbend Park. Any fans of Riverbend Park? Okay. In their visitor center. And don't forget, they got the Bluebells on the Bend this weekend. It's going to be a nice weekend. So it's a nice thing to go to. They've got this wonderful topo map. And it is just incredible. It's unencumbered of like place names and and here you can see, as I mentioned earlier, the most of these earliest roads in our continent that were Native American roads in the wooded areas, at least in the east, generally tend to have been animal paths, made through the brush. That follow high ridges of land. And here you can see the one man-made thing that they denote on here is the Beltway. You can see this is the Beltway. So here's Washington. Okay, there's the Bend of the Potomac, Mount Vernon's down here. There's Alexandria right there, and this is Hunting Creek. And you see this ridge right here, that big high ridge of land. That was where Vestals Gap Road was, and where Burr and Vandercastle got the road. They traveled from Williamsburg up to, I believe Vandercastle had property in Stafford County, and they traveled from there up to Hunting Creek and then went inland. And curiously enough, they were, part of their mission was to get what they called the emperor of the Piscataway people. They tried to talk him into coming back to Williamsburg and speaking to Governor Nicholson, and he declined. But he invited Governor Nicholson to come to Conway Island. Of course, he declined. So, but this is an explanation for why it is where it is, and why it seemed to be a viable path, and eventually got widened as it became used by the colonists. Quite a bit, and was well used, and became very travelable for the time by the mid 18th century. All right. Next slide. I'm sorry. So here's the preserved portion of Claude, and this is pretty much what it would have looked like, except perhaps not compacted gravel, and obviously it would have been dirt. But you see that it's lined mostly with their black junipers and red cedars. Some of the red cedar trees can grow beyond 300 years, or live beyond 300 years. And some of the red cedars that are along the path today, and Meredith Breed believed that some of the ones that were here on the portion at Claudemore Park were existing before the construction of Leesburg Turnpike. So they pretty much denote the scale, the width of what it would have appeared like. And if you can imagine 1,200 of General Braddock's troops marching along there, it got pretty wide in places. Let me see, how many did go? 1,200 of General Braddock's troops traveled it between 1753 and 1755. I mentioned George Washington, Daniel Boone, Sir Peter Halkett of the Grenadiers of the 44th of Foot, and Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gage of the Royal Artillery. There were also wagons, a lot of four-wheel wagons, which were not that common on the road before then. And certainly throughout the rest of the 18th century, most travel would have been by horseback or a two-wheel, what is it, chaise? What do they call it? Or shay? One of those. Actually, I think it was also like a chaise lounge or something. It was the same word they used. But of course, back then, there were several spellings and several words, but the two-wheel type of vehicles they would have used. And now, can we go to the next one? So this is Lanesville Ordinary, you all know. So we know that this section is Old Vestals Gap Road, because we know that Lanesville Ordinary was on there from the records. So going in either direction from the preserved portion on Claudemore Park, if you go out to Cascades Parkway, and you look directly across, there's Marie's Road, which clearly follows the path of, it's pretty clear that that's Old Vestals Gap Road. And there's a small portion at Dulles Town Center that, I don't know, has anybody seen that portion?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty sad. They removed the soil, they knocked down the trees, I think, and they just laid down a tarp and threw gravel on it, so nobody's going to walk on that. People with limited mobility can't travel on that, and it's surrounded by Noakes Boulevard, which is 8 lanes at that point, and a parking lot on 3 sides. But if you line it up, if you stand at the end of Marie's Road where it dumps out in that shopping center, and just kind of look across to where that portion is at Dulles Town Center, you can see that it continues there. And then, of course, there's the section across Atlantic Avenue. Next slide, Dave. Thanks. Okay, this is the part we were talking about. Helena was just mentioning that Dr. Carrata. Yeah. And so going in the other direction, if you go to past Lanesville Ordinary, there's the preserved portion that is restored, and then there's the unrestored yet preserved portion that still has the tree line. And I noticed walking on it just the other day that 2 of the red junipers are down. Did anybody notice that? So every time there's a powerful storm, probably from the March 2nd windstorm, all the high winds, every time some of those really ancient trees go down, there are fewer and fewer trees delineating the road, and it's kind of sad. But if you go down that path to the end where there's a chain link fence, and on the other side is the gentleman's property, the farmer, Dr. Carrata. I actually hopped the fence the other day. There's actually a hole in the fence, so I'm not the only one that does that. And I was trespassing on his property several years ago, and I did this as a project for a course I was taking. and I encountered a young couple walking their dogs. And I asked them, I said, you know, do you live here? And they said, oh no, we live in the houses over there. They said, but this guy lets everybody walk on his property, you know. So, and I asked them, I said, do you know what this is? And they were not aware that this was a continuation of Old Vestals Gap Road. Can you guys see that at all? It's a really cruddy picture from my cell phone, my cheapy cell phone. I don't have an iPhone 8 or whatever, 10 or whatever. But you can see the backyards of some homes here, and there's still some red cedars along there. Also, black locusts were trees that were along the side there that were very common. And I guess next slide, maybe. Okay, so going across Dr. Carrada's property, it dumps out at Sterling Boulevard. And if you're driving down Sterling Boulevard, driving south from Route 7, and you get to Juniper Avenue, East Juniper on your left, West Juniper on your right, just before you get to the Junipers, Juniper Avenue, if you look fast, you can see the roadbed and the tree line of Old Vestals Gap Road.
From Sterling Boulevard?
From Sterling Boulevard. If you know when to turn your head and look, I could point it out to you. I don't have a picture of that, but on the other side, this is what's on the other side. Now, this is looking from Argonne Avenue, which is if you turn down East Juniper, there's that little access road that runs parallel to Sterling Boulevard. Go down that access road, turn left on East Juniper, go 1 block, and then make another left, and you're on Argonne Avenue. And this is from Argonne Avenue. On the other side of this hedge right here is Sterling Boulevard. So you can't see this portion looking left from Sterling Boulevard. But looking right, you can see the portion that butts up to Dr. Carrada's property. And this portion here is it's a drainage easement. It marked Virginia Route 604. And I thought I'd be able to research Vestals Gap Road by researching Virginia Route 604. I thought, oh, I've got a route number. I'll look this up. I had no idea that 604 is this, it's like a dump zone term that not just Virginia, but every state uses for abandoned roads. I guess most of you knew that. I didn't know that. So there are like 20 Route 604s in Virginia, 20 abandoned roads, and you know. But I guarantee you, not one of them is as historic and important as this road. This little section right here would make a nice little park. If you can imagine like plantings going here and here. Look at these trees. I mean, you can't miss that. That's a little road. Put some plantings here, maybe a little center of wood chips. This right here is a little concrete construction because it is a drainage easement.
So do you know who owns that now?
VDOT apparently still owns it. When I went to the headquarters in Leesburg, I went to the planning office on the top floor. And I met this guy, and I told him, I said, I'm writing this paper for this class I'm taking at Nova. And when I first started doing this, I have to say, I was like, history. I'm a history buff, but this Vestals Gap Road, I'll just see how far this goes. And I got to tell you, before long, I was really into it. I was so captivated by learning. Where are there more signs of this old historic road where all these people traveled and was such an important... And this guy that I talked to, David Glassmore, he said he pulled out all this information. One of the things he pulled out was the original plat for Sterling Park, on which Vestals Gap Road was misidentified as an abandoned farm road. And that was 1961, I believe. And he pulled it out, and I'm looking at it. I'm looking at this thing with him. And I said, that's it. That's Vestals Gap Road. And he said, oh, and he had never heard of it. So I'm sorry, I'm looking over at you. Were you the guy that asked the question? Yeah, I'm sorry. So I'm looking at this thing with him, and he never heard of it. So when I started telling him what I was doing, he was really into it. And then he found out, he looked at some documents, and he said, I don't think VDOT knows they still have this. Those were the exact words of this guy at headquarters. you know. So I was like, wow, well, what do we do? You know, I don't know what to do. I'm not a professional. You know, I mean, I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer. I don't know what to do, you know, but I feel like something should be done, you know. Anyway, so they did, you know, Royal Associates, some developer destroyed a large portion of it when they built Sterling Park, but this is one area that remains. And then, David, if you put to the next one. And then, so there is a stretch that goes behind several homes on East Juniper Avenue, and I'm hoping I can call up the satellite image here in a moment so you can see it. It's pretty cool. But I didn't get any pictures because I didn't want to trespass on people's property in those yards. Although I did walk up to a woman who was in her front yard on East Juniper Avenue who had the cedar trees running in the line, like about, you know, 20 feet apart, running through her backyard. And I asked her, I said, do you know what this is back here? She had no idea. No idea. And I told her, and she said, oh, that's really interesting. So I told her about my little website. Now, I don't know if she ever checked it out or not, but I'm kind of jumping back and forth. I'm going into the weeds here, so to speak. But this is an area that was endangered. That, thank God, Meredith Breed, before she passed away, she was able to see this done. She had signage put up and benches and seating so that it's very clear this is Vestals Gap Road. Because on the other side of Route 28, you know, the Loudon 1, that development is just tearing. There were several stretches of it there that are just being demolished and, you know, with no thought whatsoever to preservation. But this stretch goes from Atlantic Avenue over by that Harris building with the big neon on it. And it stretches for about a good quarter mile, more than a quarter mile, I'd say a third of a mile or more. And that section, I don't know the status if those signs there will protect it, because I don't think it has, you know, landmark status. Anyway, and next one, yeah. So preserved portions, I just wanted to mention, there are some areas where the roads, Vestals Gap Road was sort of like absorbed into other roads, modern roads. Colvin Run Road is actually Vestals Gap Road, and it was actually Route 7 at one time, but around 1940 they straightened Route 7, and when they did, they created the portion to the south of Colvin Mill, and the portion that is Colvin Run Road that goes up past the millwrights, whatever he's called, the house there from like 1810 or whatever. That portion became Colvin Run Road, but it was originally a portion of Vestals Gap. Marie's Road, as I mentioned, I mean, that's obviously Vestals Gap Road. I don't know why they don't rename it. I don't know, who was Marie? I don't know. Sugarland Road, if you look at the satellite image, which I'm hoping I can pull up here with some help in a moment, you can see clearly, like the road runs, and then modern Sugarland Road is like a continuation of, I mean, we can't be 100% sure, but it's tempting to go there. It's tantalizing to think that that was it. And you know what? Meredith Breed thought that the area on the other side of Drainsville Road, or Sugarland Road, T intersects at Drainsville, and there's the concrete barriers and the signs that say road closed. Anybody know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Yes.
Has anybody ever walked beyond the concrete barriers?
Yeah.
There's that trail, and then where the power lines are, just like the power lines go in as soon as the railroads are gone, as soon as the roads are gone.
There used to be a ford across Sugar Lane Road.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and there's a path through there, and Meredith Breed thought for sure that was
Yeah,
Vestals Gap.
I'm sure.
And I've got a picture here coming up. I don't know why I didn't put these in the proper order. Here's the sign at Colvin Run Road, and it mentions Golden Run Road is a remnant of an 18th century wagon road. It doesn't say Vestals Gap, it just says 18th century wagon road. Blah, blah, blah. George Washington passed by here 1753, 54 en route to persuade the French. Blah, 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 1755 for Braddock, mentions Braddock. It was also called Braddock's Road. I forgot to mention that too. It had a bunch of names. But this is the sign, and there's literature confirming that. Right, Dave? Okay, so I would like to see that little patch that I showed you earlier at Argonne Avenue turned into a little micro park. So I investigated the process, and you have to get this, it's the, what's it called, the pin, or the paper is called, phooey, bear with me, preliminary information form. Okay, so from the Virginia Landmarks Registry, preliminary information form, application for consideration, and has instructions on how to submit the form, blah, blah, instructions. So what they need, and I've actually got, to make this short, let me just, basically, here are 3 things that you have to prove. Okay, there must be prior historic documentation of the site in question. The proposed site must have historical and archaeological significance. There must be research issues that can be effectively addressed by the archaeological remains at the site. There's prior historical documentation of the site in question, certainly, and that stretch on Argonne Avenue is clearly a continuation of Old Vestals Gap Road. When you look at the satellite image, it's clearly Vestals Gap Road. Okay, so we know there's historical documentation. Proposed site must have historical and archaeological significance. We know that. There must be research issues that can be effectively addressed by the archaeological remains. Well, going back to Lanesville, the Lanesville Ordinary, when they did, in 1998, I think, is when they preserved that section of Vestals Gap Road. They did some test digs there. Here it is. The 3,200-foot section of Old Vestals Gap Road that crosses Claude Moore Park in Sterling has already been awarded a listing on the National Register of Historic Places and an historic marker or 2. This portion has been investigated by archaeologists Donna J. Seifert and Brian Corley during the nomination process for entry to the National Register of Historic Places. They conducted what they call shovel tests, where they just make these random digs, kind of based on, you know, educated guesses on where they might find artifacts. Of the 39 test digs they did on the roadbed, not close to the house, but in the roadbed, which is like, you know, like 30 feet from the Lanesville Ordinary, 30 of the 39 brought up artifacts. Things like military buttons, tools, housewares, implements, things associated with horses and maintaining horses. I didn't hear any mention of coins. That's what
How far did they dig? Do you know how far they dug?
That's a good question. And you know, again, you know, I was wowed by David and Paul. It's like, you guys are like, have so much information. I've seen Dr. David Clark on digs. He's, does anybody know Dr. Clark? David Clark. Awesome dude. He single-handedly tried to fight the developers of Dulles Town Center to get them to maintain, to preserve Old Vestals Gap Road. And in the end, they made that little concession of, like, you know, that little tiny stretch, keeping that.
The pocket park?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And but Dr. Clark, I was observing him digging at Lanesville about 5 years ago on the 4th of July. They had a, you know, and Mary was there, and he had was down to a depth about from that table to the floor. So, what is that, like 2.5 feet? 3 feet? So, not knowing anything about archaeology, wanting to learn, I assume that was like probably the same depth they might have gone to. So maybe about 3 feet. I really don't know, and that's good. I'm glad I can get that feedback because I'm going to ask that question.
Can we see your map?
Yeah, let's do that. Let me just see, is there one more? I think there's one more, and then that's the last one. So the marker. So this is the process for getting the marker. Probably, most of you probably know this. You're involved in preservation. So for me, this is a learning process. I just learned all of this in the last 5-6 years. And of course, this is the busiest slide I could possibly put up there. But anyway, you have to create the text, suggest location, blah, blah, blah. You have to send it. There's a back and forth you do. Yeah.
Well, so my question is then, if you're talking about like that section off of Oregon or off of Atlantic Boulevard or whatever, what does it take to get an archaeological dig there that will mean something? Because, I mean, that could be something that really...
Wouldn't I like to know?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how you do that, but I mean, I think that if somebody said they found something there, then that would certainly make a good case.
And I'm wondering how, if they necessarily had found anything at Lanesville prior to the 1998 digs, or if they just said, we expect to find something.
Lanesville's already preserved though, but I'm talking about this would give you power to save these other sections that are still there that are but are in danger.
So should I take my metal detector there and try to find something?
Neil, I know that Bill and Jackie are interested in getting a marker also up in Old Sterling. Maybe we can, because we're running out of time. I think probably we need to have another discussion. This is very, very important in recognizing and putting up historic markers, not only here but in other areas of Sterling. So perhaps we can engage everyone and have just a business meeting of sorts as to how we could do this.
That sounds great.
Okay. And I have a couple of people who are not able to be here tonight who I think you would probably also want to speak to. I'm thinking with Dullestown Center, they always have applications coming in. This would be a good time also to go back to the developer, and I know the vice president of the town center, and maybe have him come in to, because so much more information has come in since they built the center. So, and history is so much more relevant now in communities. So maybe able to get, a donation or something like that. So let's carry that discussion to another meeting, if we could. And I'm just looking at the time, they're going to throw us out at 9 o'clock.
Ellen, if it's possible, David, is it possible to go on line and pull up?
I don't know.
Okay.
Because I want to see the map. I want to see the road.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Let's
that's...
just go to Chrome and see if we can. Shut that down. And what was it? I googled. It was Sterling, a satellite image of Sterling, Virginia 20164.
And everyone, if you could help put chairs away, when we are leaving, that would be so very helpful to us. And just stay around for a couple of minutes and mingle, and we'll get you, if you filled in the sign-in sheet, then we'll continue this conversation. If you haven't signed up, just see me.
The county map department also
Yeah.
has
His was.
maps.
Yeah.
Maps where you can
You won't be able to do it without an internet connection.
hear how the county grew.
I'm sorry.
That's a great idea.
You won't be able to do it without an internet connection.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm using the fellows from the, so, but I wasn't able to get onto the projector yet. If you Google satellite image of Sterling, Virginia 20164, and go to where the high school and Claudemore Park is, and where it actually labels Vestals Gap Road, and then grab it and like pull it over, notice where it goes across the farmland, Dr. Barada's farm, and then it goes across Sterling, and you can clearly see East Juniper Avenue. You see the houses there, the little single-family homes with their fences. You clearly see this line, this dark line of the roadbed and the trees, the tree line. It's very clear. And if you follow that, Juniper Avenue itself takes a turn, but that darkened area continues and it hooks up with Sugarland Road. And if you follow that down past the mosque and to the T intersection with Drainsville Road and go across to the trail, again you can see an open space, and it's pretty clear.
Perhaps you can do a map on your website?
Yeah, what's your website?
Yeah, well, I got to tell you, I'm very, very flattered. This all came about, I mean, I had no idea I was going to be, and I really appreciate you inviting me to speak. My website is Old Vestals Gap Road, Preserving Traces of Our History. I have to think of the name.
Okay. Can you send it to Todd or to me, and then we'll get it up for everyone?
Yeah, and then you know what, and I haven't really updated it or added anything, but now I'm really inspired to do that. I gotta say that, and it's seeing how many people are here. Seeing how many people are here that are interested. I'm sorry?
First presentation.
This is my first presentation.
You're honored. You're honored. Thank you so much.
You're not half as honored as I am. Thank you very much.
Okay. Everyone, we'll just ask you all to mingle if you'd like to get a book. David and Paul's book, they're available here. How much are they, guys?
$23.31 for each book.
$23.31. Is that tax included?
Yeah, that includes tax.
All righty. Thank you so much. Pardon me?
Where do you want the chair, Terry?
In the back on the